So this is an introduction to the overall themes of the genetics course. So we'll get into basic definitions and some kind of scope of the course. And of course, getting started, we need to think about what it is that we're discussing in this course. What is genetics? So genetics, you probably have a rough idea of what we're talking about here. Genetics has to do with the study of how organisms inherit features from their parents. So an example here, a litter of puppies. Let's say these puppies were born to the same parents. They look different, right? So the field of genetics can help us get in there and investigate what it is that makes them have different coat colors, whatever their other features are that might be of interest. And when I ask students about genetics, quite often I get the answer, what are we talking about when we talk about genetics? We're talking often about, so genetics, give me a little bit slow on the writing here. Genetics, this field has to do with genes. And so this will be a big topic of the course to discuss what a gene is and how genes fit in to the whole process. And when I ask students what genes are or what it means to be a gene, a lot of times I get the answer that genes have something to do with DNA. So this is something that's in the common vocabulary these days. We talk about DNA. People probably have a good idea of what's going on, even if they're not biology majors. And of course, if you've taken the prerequisite biology courses for this, you should have some familiarity with DNA. So DNA is a molecule of basically an information containing molecule that's present in our cells. And when we go on to produce offspring, when a person has children or an animal or plant has offspring, they pass on their genetic information in the form of this DNA molecule. So this is the major anchor for what we talk about with genetics. And the term genetics is related to this other term you might know, genesis. So genesis has to do with the origin of things, right? Where did it come from? What is the genesis of that idea? So again, if you look at an organism and you're interested to know some feature that it has, and you want to know where that feature came from, the simple answer might be that the feature was inherited from the parents. But if you dive more deeply and you investigate the DNA, then a little more complicated version of genetics would be to investigate exactly what part of that DNA was inherited from the parent that produced the feature on the organism. So we'll be looking at all those concepts as we go through this course. So genetics, mostly, at least at the beginning of the course, we're going to talk about inheriting from parents. And I started with some dogs there. Here's some other dogs. This is another perspective on dog appearance or phenotype. We have all these different dog breeds being shown in this image. And dogs are an interesting case because the ancestral version of most dog breeds was basically a wild wolf kind of animal. And over thousands of years, people got involved, sometimes not so long as 1,000 years, but sometimes in just tens of years, a person could, with careful breeding, controlling the kinds of features that are inherited, a person can selectively breed dogs that have some features of interest. So, ear size, dog size, behavioral traits, some of those can have genetic underpinnings. A lot of them do, right? So if you're a family and you're choosing a dog, you can choose a breed based on some features that the breed has. So you might have a dog that's good with kids, or a good guard dog, or one that's more tame and relaxed versus one that's more energetic. People can choose their dog features based on what's present in the breed and get kind of a reliable output. No matter what dog you're getting, if you're getting a dog of a certain breed, you're going to get a lot of features that kind of align with the standard for that dog. As I mentioned, genetics is an ongoing field of investigation. We can learn all kinds of stuff studying genetics. So people usually come in with an organism of interest. A lot of people are studying human genetics for obvious reasons, to learn more about ourselves and genetic diseases that might be problems for people. But there's also a whole bunch of people who study just whatever organisms are out there. If it's alive, it's got DNA and it's got genes. So some examples on here, a person might be studying the genetic basis for differences in these flicker birds. So different kinds of flickers in different parts of North America. And this is part of a study that was investigating these features that are useful for telling them apart and maybe what genes are responsible for making those various features. So largely here, just features of coloration. But because these are inherited from a parent, these have genetic underpinnings and can be investigated. Same thing here in the middle image. This is a flower shown on the left, a natural wild type version of this flower. Has bilateral symmetry. It points off to the side, has a difference in the top and bottom appearance, and it's presenting to pollinators, pollinating insects in a way that they would approach it from the side. And this right-hand part of this image, D and E, show the same species that's got a genetic mutation. And this is kind of an interesting study that demonstrated that there's one gene, one important gene that's responsible for that switch. So if the gene has the normal wild type function, it produces these normal sideways pointing flowers. But if that gene is mutated and can't do its function, you get one of these where the flowers point upright, which may still be adaptive. So you might have a different form of flowers in different individuals, and this one might be attractive to different kinds of insects, for example. So not to say that any one form of flower or other organism form is, inherently better than another. And finally, on the right, topic we'll talk about later in the semester, we'll get into more detail on this. Something of interest to the human population is the ability to digest lactose. So some individuals in adulthood are what we call lactose intolerant, and that means that they are missing the enzyme that can digest milk sugar or lactose. So those people have an unpleasant experience if they drink or eat dairy products based on the enzyme that they have for digesting those, and that has a genetic basis as well. And then also something that kind of ties in with that is this map of the global human population and the prevalence of lactose intolerance. So in North America, a lot of the people in North America are okay to eat and drink dairy products, but a good chunk of the world not so similarly equipped. Kind of lines up pretty well with populations that are ancestrally associated with cow cultivation, right? Dairy production, pretty good to be able to drink milk if you are in a culture that raises cows, huh? Okay, so there are limits, of course, to what genetics can study. We can't learn everything about every person by using genetic tools. Not everything about an organism is genetic. So this is an example of something that's been investigated pretty thoroughly. I'd say there's a good number of scientists out there who might be interested to know if there was something genetic about homosexuality. So it's been investigated by a few people. And the consensus so far is that there's not a genetic basis to this. So this is something that's ingrained in individuals and uh, definitely a difference among humans, but it's not, as far as we can tell, it's not something that's inherited in a genetic form from the parents to their offspring. So, it's if you're studying genetics, you're not going to learn everything. You can learn a lot of things, and then just using genetic tools, you might use those tools to discover that you've got something like this that can't be explained by genetics, and you would be able to sort of conclusively draw that conclusion based on the evidence that you've got. One thing I like to get out of the way as we get started in this course is one of these concepts that sometimes I don't know how well to how to do this best to treat this concept. A lot of times we're going to talk about a kind of a majority genetic set of genes and alleles and so on. In the fruit flies we study in lab, we're going to call that the wild type. So sort of this feature set that's normally found in a population, and gets a little dodgy when we talk about the human population, because of course it's kind of inherent. I think people have feelings about this term when we talk about people who are normal, right? So Normal, the contrast to that, there's not a great contrasting word, right? Something like abnormal certainly doesn't sound nice. So I'm just going to tell you right now that during this course, I might use this term normal. It's a term that's kind of helpful to establish what we're talking about. This is basically a term referring to the majority of individuals. And it relates to something that's shown on the screen here called a normal distribution that you've probably seen before. So normal distribution has an average or a mean, and there's a set of variation around that mean. So you could take something that you can measure, like human height or weight or lengths of something, fingers, arms. Um, if you could put a number on something like eye color, you might get some variation this way. And it means that there's an average. Let's stick with height for a second. There's an average height, and there are people who are shorter than the average height and taller than the average height. And for the most part, most people are near the average. And if you go far away, this decreasing slope here, this means that far away from the mean, there are some people who are exceptionally shorter than the average height. There's some people who are exceptionally taller than the average height, but those are people who are, it's a rare condition to have. And so we'll talk about things that are normal. I'll try to avoid using the word abnormal, but for example, some features like chromosome number. The average, the normal human chromosome number is 46. Not every person has that chromosome number, but by and large, that's something that's found in the human population. So try not to judge if I use this term, try not to feel like it's a judgment on anything, quality of individual or anything like that. Just a useful term for talking about really a majority kind of feature. So human features, we talked about height. Here's some distribution curves for humans. This is one sample of individuals for men and women. You probably know that men on average are taller. So the average man is taller than the average woman. That's, you know, you do enough surveying of people, you'll find that that is very reliable as far as an average. You can compare the average of men and the average of women. This is just a truth about how we're put together. So men and women are different, and this is one of the features that is also different about them. And then highlighting, as I showed you before, some exceptionally tall people and exceptionally short people. These are, I believe, as this was taken, maybe the tallest and shortest people in the world. So it can be interesting to study differences, but I think it's important, especially when we study humans, to just bear in mind that you know, we're embracing diversity, but also not judging quality of people based on anything about their genetic makeup. So a little highlight, I think this is helpful to kind of put it in perspective. A lot of times we get in Wisconsin, we get people who fall into the group of people who are descended from Northern Europe, right? So we have a lot of people in the Caucasian category, people descended from people in Northern Europe. And looking around in Wisconsin, you can get kind of a perspective about what you think is normal for your people around you. But if you take a global perspective on this, some of the features that we have in Wisconsin are not necessarily on the global majority. So just kind of working our way through some of these, I've got on here percentages of individuals in the human population that have a certain feature. So starting off, if we talk about something being normal, the normal human has 10 fingers. That goes for 99.8% of people genetically born with 10 fingers. There's a few people who are not, but by and large, 10 fingers for humans. Some features that maybe don't align with your expectations of folks in Wisconsin: having brown eyes. So brown eye color, the iris color there, 80% of people in the world have brown iris color. This was the original human eye color, and developing blue eyes, that was something that was derived later in human evolution in some human populations. Lactose intolerance, as I mentioned, this is actually the majority condition if you consider the number of people worldwide. So big chunks of people in the world who are lactose intolerant. It's not really a normal condition to be drinking milk in adulthood. But we have, again, in Wisconsin, certainly the dairy state, a lot of people who are, you know, drinking milk in adulthood, raising dairy cattle. and taking advantage of that dietary option to eat things that are dairy products. And that's sort of a cultural condition that goes back to the ancestors of the people who are the majority in Wisconsin. And then finally, one more that's kind of a little esoteric. Some people I like to ask when we're in person if anybody is averse to cilantro. And there's a population of people in the world, about 1 in 5 people would tell you that cilantro tastes to them like soap or very unpleasant. So I'm a person who enjoys the taste of cilantro, but as far as taste receptors, there's a version of our taste receptors that is really doesn't enjoy cilantro. And that's not a majority condition, but it is interestingly present in a few people. So some of our genetic underpinnings can be really interesting to learn about. And I hope we take an open mind to learning about ourselves and also just the human population in this course. And I mentioned the gene for homosexuality is something that's been pursued and hasn't really been conclusively demonstrated. Here's another one. Every once in a while, you see one of these headlines where something comes up as having a genetic basis. And this is from a little while back. Infidelity, the gene for cheating. So this was a set of studies that basically were proposing the idea that some people are genetically programmed to cheat on their significant others. So risk taking and cheating seem to go together with a genetic basis. I just kind of want to introduce this with an idea that you want to take all of these with a grain of salt. Just because something is found as a statistically significant difference or presence doesn't mean that that is, say, the sole explanation, right? So there can be people who are genetically prone to cheating on their significant others, but that may not explain all or even most of the individuals who are prone to cheating. So again, we can explain some things with genetics, and we want to keep in mind that not everything can always be explained by genetics. So in this course, we're going to talk about 3 main sort of subsets of genetics, and this is how your book presents them also. So transmission genetics, the idea of transmitting information from parents to offspring. Transmission genetics has to do with really one set of parents and the kinds of children that they can have based on some genetic feature or 2 or 3 that you're interested in. Another one, looking in more detail, we're going to cover molecular genetics, and this has to do with the molecules. So DNA is a molecule, and DNA is involved in a process of producing RNA and proteins. And that's, as we get into molecular genetics, we'll see that this is really the root cause for genetic phenotypes or appearances. So when somebody has a pigment in their eye, they got brown eyes versus blue eyes, that's the result of some enzyme or protein that's been made differently in those individuals to produce those different eye colors. So we'll get into this a little bit earlier on in this course and just have it as an understanding as we go along. And then toward the end of the course, we'll talk about population genetics. This is where we look at groups of individuals, not working necessarily about one parent, one set of parents at a time, but more just as all possible parents in mixing all possible combinations of genes and alleles. We'll cover this just a little bit toward the end of the course, and there's also a lot of overlap in this topic with material that gets covered in evolution and a little bit of ecology. So we just covered it a little bit in this course. So that's our introduction, and we'll get into the meat of this in a little bit here.